Some disappearances leave questions that never stop whispering. Some leave a scene so precise and unsettling that it lodges in the mind, a detail you can't shake. Viewer discretion is advised. This episode will describe disturbing crime scenes and traumatic witness accounts. I'll stay clinical where it's needed and compassionate where the people involved deserve it. I've chosen 10 disappearances that linger, not because they're the most sensational, but because each one reveals a human life interrupted in a way that keeps families searching, investigators turning over old files, and communities unable to forget. My criteria were simple: unresolved mysteries or haunting discoveries, credible witnesses whose memories refuse to fade, cases that were cold for years and later changed course because of forensic breakthroughs, and those that expose institutional failures that matter. 2 of these stories, one from 1993 in Missouri and one from 1949 in Philadelphia, are drawn from deep, documented reporting. The rest will be developed with the same rigor. Where final sourcing is still required, I flagged placeholders for the production team to verify and fill before publication. If this episode lands on something you find hard to watch, consider pausing. There's no shame in stepping away. If you want more deep dives like this, consider subscribing. I'll try to bring these cases and the available documents to the description so you can read for yourself. Case 1. Angie Hausman, 1993, St. Anne, Missouri. It begins with a school bus and a 9-year-old who never made it home. Angela, Angie, Hausman, was a small girl in a neighborhood where kids still walked from the bus stop. On the afternoon she vanished. She walked off the bus and headed toward her house the way she had 100 times. When she didn't arrive, the first instincts were ordinary: wait, call, search the nearby yards. Those instincts would turn into weeks of searching and a family's slow, escalating dread. The initial police response was active, but ultimately hampered by the limits of witness reliability and the way small-town tips can black out under the weight of unanswered questions. There were sporadic sightings: a dark car idling near the bus stop, a man described by a few residents as having behaved oddly, but none of those threads produced a suspect. Days became a week. On the 9th day, a deer hunter walking through the bush wildlife area found something that would finally draw investigators into the woods. Viewer discretion note: the next details are disturbing. I will describe them clinically. The hunter came across Angie's body pinned to a tree. Her hands were bound, duct tape covered her head, and her clothing showed signs investigators would later characterize as consistent with assault.
The coroner's office determined she had been sexually assaulted and that hypothermia was the cause listed on the death certificate. The medical examiner noted she may have been alive not long before she was found. A small town that had been searching for a child now stood over an evidence-saturated scene: fibers, blood, and an item that would live on in case files for decades: underwear that eventually became a source of preserved biological material. For years, the case sat cold. DNA technology was not where it is today. Evidence was collected, cataloged, and stored, awaiting improved tools. The family never stopped asking questions. Angie's mother and stepfather, made public at the time and in subsequent reporting, pressed police and took tips when they came. The community held vigils. Files accumulated dust, but also traces, small and crucial, of the person who had come through their neighborhood. The breakthrough came not from a new witness, but from science. In 2018, decades-old evidence was reanalyzed. 2 contributors were found in the DNA profile extracted from the preserved underwear, a frustrating compound signal, but one that permitted future cross-referencing as databases grew. In 2019, that reanalysis yielded a match in the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. The match returned a name already known to investigators: Earl Cox, a man with a criminal history that included convictions for sexual offenses, a military background that placed him in the Air Force years earlier, and a parole record that, in the weeks and months after the match, raised questions about systemic oversight. Court documents and press releases from the region show police moved quickly. Confronted with the DNA match and the weight of documentary evidence, Cox pleaded guilty in 2020 to charges tied to Angie's death. Prosecutors secured life without parole. He later agreed to tell a fuller account to investigators, offering details that filled some gaps and left others untouched. In 2024, reports indicate he died in custody. What haunts this case is not only the calculated cruelty of the scene itself, but the series of institutional failures that allowed a predator to remain in circulation long enough to strike again. The files ask uncomfortable questions about how prior convictions were managed, about parole decisions, and about the systems intended to protect children. For Angie's family, DNA brought a measure of justice, but not the ordinary kind of closure that anyone would want. The years between disappearance and conviction are years spent in a kind of suspended grief. For investigators, the case demonstrates how modern forensic tools can alter the arc of a decades-old hunt, and how often those tools arrive only after the most profound damage has been done. What stays with those who read the reports is the image a witness recorded in a notebook years earlier, and the knowledge that had the match come sooner, pleas might have been different.
But that is speculation. The facts remain that biological evidence, preserved and reanalyzed, led to a CODIS hit. That hit led to a guilty plea and a life sentence, and that a 9-year-old named Angie never came home. Case 2. Dorothy Forstein, 1949, Philadelphia. Some disappearances feel impossibly modern. Others read like fragments of an older world, when records were paper and conversations happened at kitchen tables. Dorothy Forstein's case is both. In 1945, she was brutally assaulted in a crime that nearly took her life. She survived with lasting injuries and an anxiety that followed her family for years. 4 years later, while her husband Jules, a municipal judge, slept, Dorothy was carried out of her locked home. The smallest witness is sometimes the most telling. Their 9-year-old daughter, Marcy, later gave a consistent account. She saw a man lift her mother and carry her away, moving calmly, even patting Marcy's head as he passed. There was no sign of forced entry, no theft. The intruder, by every outward measure, left the house as though he belonged to the dark that night. Neighbors reported nothing suspicious until daylight. Police examined the home and found no obvious trail, only a family shattered by an absence that made no immediate sense. Investigators at the time followed leads that ranged from the personal to the political. A theory that circulated involved a man named Morris Anmuth and the possibility of a vendetta against Judge Jules Forstein. Journalists and police pursued that angle, but it never yielded the legal certainty needed for charges. Dorothy's prior attack in 1945 made some officers and neighbors think the incidents might be linked, an unnerving pattern, but the evidence was circumstantial. In an era before widespread centralized databases and before DNA testing could be dreamt of as an investigative mainstay, the case relied on witness statements, dental records preserved by the family, and the patient work of detectives. Marcy's testimony was central. Her account didn't shift over interviews, which gave investigators confidence in its reliability. But child testimony, even when consistent, can only go so far in a criminal case without corroborative physical evidence. Dorothy was never found. Her husband, Jules, carried the legal and emotional consequences of a loss that had no closure. He died in 1956. By 1957, Dorothy was legally declared dead, a procedural step families sometimes take to settle affairs when the law's balance between hope and practicality demands it. What remains haunting about this case is the ordinary domesticity of the scene: a locked house, a child who watched without being the target, and a set of unanswered motives. Dorothy's dental records remain preserved, a small technical fact that represents one of the few enduring threats. The possibility, however remote, that identification could come if remains were ever discovered. That slim hope is a form of cruel consolation. It keeps the door ajar without promising that anyone will walk through it. Between these two cases, one resolved by late-arriving science, one frozen in mid-20th century uncertainty, you can see a pattern. Both reveal the vulnerability of everyday life. Both show how a single small detail, duct tape, a pat on a child's head, a set of dental records, can come to symbolize the whole of a family's loss. In one case, DNA eventually led to a legal end. In the other, the case ends in a legal fiction of death, while the facts themselves remain stubbornly incomplete. If you thought that was unsettling, wait until you hear what comes next. Case 03. Details pending. Production to verify. This slot is reserved for a case that matches the series criteria: a vanishing with either a credible child witness, a locked house enigma, a puzzling staging, or a cold case solved by later forensics. The production intends to choose a case that deepens the themes already present in Angie's and Dorothy's stories: the tininess of the hinge on which a life turns, the institutional limits of an earlier era, or the bittersweet arrival of justice decades later. Case 04. Details pending. Production to verify. Similarly, this entry will be selected from a list of verified public record disappearances. The aim here is to vary geography and era, perhaps a coastal disappearance, perhaps an interstate case that exposes gaps in communication between agencies. The narrative will emphasize key investigative steps and the human aftermath.
Interlude. Why do some disappearances haunt us more than others? It isn't only the grotesque or the sensational. It's the way a case resists tidy endings. It's the image that lodges in a witness's memory, a man's calm touch, a child's voice naming a detail, and refuses to resolve itself into justice. It's the years of files stacked in evidence rooms while families continue to mark birthdays and anniversaries without the person they love. I'm keeping the list tight and the focus on cases that do two things at once. They tell the story of an individual life lost or stolen, and they illuminate a systemic truth about policing, about forensic science, about how societies respond to the most intimate kinds of lawlessness. The next sections will bring us deeper into that terrain. Case 05, details pending, production to verify. This entry is earmarked for a case where a body was discovered under perplexing circumstances, staged perhaps, or found in a place that contradicted the last known movements of the missing person. If the production team opts to fill this slot with a historically older case, we'll take care to avoid retrofitting modern forensic explanations on mid-century files. Historical context matters.
Case 06, details pending, production to verify. Planned for a disappearance involving a predator later apprehended elsewhere, this story would show how criminal mobility complicates local investigations and how victims' families often face the frustration of seeing a suspect's record only after more harm has been done. At this point in the list, I want to pause on what investigators often say about preserved evidence. It's never neutral. A swab in a paper envelope, a battered shoelace, a faded photograph, each artifact carries a potential truth and a limited lifespan of utility. The ability to extract DNA from decades-old samples has transformed cold case work, but it also exposes how unevenly preservation has happened across jurisdictions and across time. Some evidence survives in pristine form, some is lost because of poor chain of custody, environmental damage, or early procedural mistakes. Families who have spent years pushing for evidence to be tested often learn to live with an uneasy mixture of hope and bureaucratic inertia. Case 07, details pending, production to verify. This slot is reserved for a case where a child witness provided the single coherent detail that kept a file alive. The story will explore both the power and the limitations of such testimony, how consistent recollection can be, the ways interviews can be conducted sensitively, and the risk of placing too much weight on a solitary recollection without corroborating evidence. Case 08, details pending, production to verify. Here, the plan is to include a case solved years later by DNA reanalysis. The narrative will examine the life cycle of an evidence item, collection, storage, technological obsolescence, and eventual re-examination. It will also touch on the emotional impact on families who live through renewed investigations. Some find relief, others feel opened wounds. Interlude. 2/3 of the way through this episode, I want to underline something important. When a disappearance goes cold, it doesn't mean investigators stop thinking about it. Many of these cases live in the minds of detectives who retire with folders full of paper they can't close. New detectives inherit old files, and sometimes a fresh set of eyes sees what previous investigators missed. Sometimes a clerk digitizes a report and finds a misfiled note. Progress doesn't always come in courtroom dramas. It often arrives in the quiet work of organizing, re-examining, and making connections. Case 09, details pending, production to verify. This late slot will hold one of the more emotionally resonant cases on the list, a disappearance that has split public opinion, attracted intense media attention, or left a community in a long-term state of watchfulness. If the production team can verify a case where the person vanished from a seemingly secure location, for instance a locked car, a guarded facility, or a supervised public space, that will likely fit here. Case 10, details pending, planned for maximum haunt. I've saved one of the most haunting unresolved narratives for the last slot. Whether the production ultimately places Dorothy here or another case that matches her degree of emotional resonance will depend on the final lineup. The final entry is where the episode will aim to leave you, with a single image, a single unanswered question, and the sense that some absences never truly close. Closing the first act of this episode, I want to emphasize what threads run through these stories already told and those we will develop. First, victims are people whose names and mundane habits should not be swallowed by a case file. Saying their names, Angela, Dorothy, is a small restoration of who they were. Second, forensic science is not magic. It can open doors if evidence has been preserved and databases grow, and if legal frameworks permit reanalysis. Third, unresolved cases leave a different kind of harm, one that multiplies over time because anniversaries keep coming, and the search never gets to end in the way living families need. We'll pick up on the remaining entries with detailed sourced narratives in the next segment. For each developed case, we will include year, location, key investigative facts, the human reactions that matter, and the current legal or unresolved status. And I'll point to primary documents in the description so you can follow the sources directly. If you've been following closely and have a well-sourced tip or a suggestion for cases I should examine, there's a secure form linked below for submissions to the production team. Do not post tips in the comments or attempt private investigations. Police contact information and case numbers will be in the description where appropriate. Before we move on, take a moment. These aren't just cold headlines. They are unfinished stories of real people. We keep searching because someone once chose to look, and because, in some cases, the smallest preserved detail can change everything. Case 03, Asha Degree, 2000, Shelby, North Carolina. Asha Degree was 9 years old when she vanished in the small hours of a February morning. Her family lived in a rural part of North Carolina. On the night she left, the house was quiet and the rest of the household slept. Sometime before dawn, Asha packed a small bag, left a note of no clear meaning, and walked away from home. A passing motorist later reported seeing a young girl walking along the shoulder of a highway early that morning, but the sighting did not immediately lead to a rescue. Police treated the disappearance as an abduction from the start, but the physical evidence was sparse: footprints in the soil, a few items of clothing found near a nearby river months later, and the small, haunting traces families keep: an empty bed, an uneaten breakfast. Investigators canvassed the area, followed tips, and kept files open for years.
The case remained in the public eye partly because Asha's mother became an outspoken advocate, pressing for new leads and keeping the story alive in the hopes that someone who remembered that morning would come forward. Over time, investigators pursued multiple theories: that Asha had wandered off and become lost in the woods, that she had been picked up by a stranger, that a vehicle, described in some reports as a dark van, had been involved. None of these hypotheses produced conclusive proof. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children listed Asha as missing, and law enforcement periodically asked the public to re-examine older tips in light of improved databases and digital tools. What lingers is the image of a child choosing, for unknown reasons, to step into the night and never return. For Asha's family, every anniversary is another reminder that absence can be its own persistent presence. The case remains open, a reminder that sometimes the only thing left to hold is the determination of those who refuse to let a file close. Case 04, Madeleine McCann, 2007, Praia da Luz, Portugal. Madeleine McCann's disappearance quickly became an international story, not only because she was 3 years old and on holiday with her family, but because the circumstances felt ordinary until they unspooled into something terrifying. On a warm evening in May 2007, Madeleine was sleeping in a holiday flat while her parents dined with friends at a nearby tapas bar. When they checked on their children, Madeleine was gone. Window shutters were closed. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Portuguese police immediately opened an investigation that would stretch for years and cross borders. The case drew intense media scrutiny, private investigators, and thousands of public tips. Witness statements, vehicle sightings, and forensic traces were all examined, but nothing produced the conclusive evidence needed to bring a reliable charge in court. That lack of a clear legal endpoint, coupled with high-profile reporting and persistent public interest, helped sustain investigations in multiple countries for more than a decade. Years later, investigators in other jurisdictions took new interest. German authorities identified a man they believed to be connected to the disappearance, and that line of inquiry prompted renewed searches and international cooperation. Yet, even as suspects have been named publicly and leads pursued, the case remains officially unresolved, in the sense that no conviction has given Madeleine's family the legal answer they and the public have sought. What the McCann case reveals is how a single mundane decision, parents leaving a sleeping child for an hour, can become the hinge of a decades-long investigation. It also shows the limits of publicity. Attention can produce leads, but it can also saturate an inquiry with noise.
The public hunger for answers has never dimmed, and Madeleine's name continues to be spoken by people who hope that a preserved hint or a new witness can finally settle what happened that night. Case 05, Etan Potts, 1979, Soho, New York City. Etan Potts was 6 years old when he walked to his school bus stop in Manhattan and was never seen again. His disappearance in 1979 shocked a city already skeptical about the safety of its streets and accelerated changes in how missing child cases were handled nationwide. For years, Etan's photograph, the face on the milk carton, became one of the most recognizable symbols of an era's anxieties. The investigation spanned decades. Law enforcement followed an array of leads, some more credible than others. In 2012, a man named Pedro Hernandez gave a confession claiming responsibility. His plea was initially dismissed by some investigators as unreliable. Subsequent legal developments produced a retrial, and in 2017, Hernandez was convicted of Etan's murder. The conviction was based in part on his own statements and corroborating elements prosecutors presented. To many who had followed the case, it felt like a form of resolution after nearly 4 decades. For Etan's parents, the outcome brought mixed feelings. Conviction answered the basic legal question of responsibility, but it could not return the years, birthdays, and ordinary life stolen from their son. Etan's case also left longer-lasting changes in its wake. The widespread adoption of child missing alerts and new protocols for rapid response became part of the institutional legacy that followed his disappearance. What haunts the Potts story is both the smallness of the original scene, a boy walking to a bus stop, and the enormous institutional lessons that rose from it. The case is an example of how persistent attention and evolving legal strategy can eventually produce accountability, even when many years separate crime and conviction. Case 06, Amy Lynn Bradley, 1998, Caribbean, Royal Caribbean Cruise. Amy Lynn Bradley was 23 when she disappeared from a cruise ship in the Caribbean. She was traveling with family on vacation when, during a port stop, she was seen on bridge surveillance footage and later reported missing when she didn't return to her cabin. Unlike many land-based disappearances, this one unfolded on a moving vessel in international waters, an environment that complicates jurisdiction, evidence collection, and the logistics of a search. Shipboard CCTV and eyewitness statements became central to the investigation. Some footage placed Amy in public areas of the ship late into the evening. Other passenger reports suggested she left in the company of strangers. The family's pleas for information received broad media coverage, and law enforcement from multiple countries coordinated to varying degrees.
Over the years, tips surfaced, some credible, others less so, claiming sightings in coastal towns or linking her disappearance to illicit activity ashore. None delivered verifiable proof that Amy was alive or that a suspect could be arrested. Amy's case exemplifies the challenges of missing person investigations that cross maritime and international boundaries. Evidence collected at sea can be transient, jurisdictional gaps can slow inquiries, and the trail of witnesses disperses across ports and countries. For Amy's family, each tip that fades into uncertainty renews public sympathy but offers no firm path to closure. What remains disturbing is the sense of movement without direction, a ship that continued its route, passengers who returned to their routines, and a woman who vanished from a space designed for leisure and safety. The case still bears the uneasy mark of unresolved possibility. Someone somewhere might have seen something that mattered, but it has yet to crystallize into proof. Case 7, Natalie Holloway, 2005, Oranjestad, Aruba. Natalie Holloway disappeared in May 2005 while on a high school graduation trip to Aruba. She was last seen leaving a nightclub with a small group of young men. The island's investigation was intense and immediate, with searches, interviews, and international attention pouring into a relatively small local police force. Witness accounts varied, and initial leads produced dead ends. Evidence that could have helped was limited or inconclusive. One name came to dominate media coverage and public imagination, and that man's subsequent behavior and legal entanglements kept the case in headlines for years. Investigators pursued multiple angles, some that led nowhere, others that suggested the possibility of a tragic accident or a crime that could not be proved. Over time, comments made in private, international travel of persons of interest, and differing standards between local and foreign law enforcement created a complicated mosaic of claims and counterclaims. For Natalie's family, the public scrutiny was a double-edged sword. Media attention kept the story alive and generated tips, but it also created a press environment in which rumors and sensational theories sometimes crowded out sober investigation. Natalie's disappearance remains officially unresolved. The island issued statements over the years updating the public on periodic searches and forensic efforts. What endures in this case is the image of a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, whose absence transformed a celebration into a family's decades-long search. The Holloway story underscores how international cases can entangle cultural and legal differences, and how grief can become a global conversation when an ordinary vacation turns catastrophic. Interlude. By now you've heard accounts that range across decades and geographies.
What ties them together is not a single motive or a single modus operandi. It's the way ordinary routines, walking to a bus stop, retiring to bed, stepping onto a porch, can be interrupted by something that leaves behind only traces. The next set of cases probes that interruption from different angles: contested evidence, disputed photos, and the special kind of public obsession that can both help and hinder a search. Case 08, Johnny Gosch, 1982, West Des Moines, Iowa. Johnny Gosch was a 12-year-old paperboy who disappeared on his delivery route in 1982. His case quickly became emblematic of the era's fears about child abduction. Neighbors remembered him as responsible, like many paperboys his age. The route he walked was familiar. One morning, he simply did not return. Police investigations produced no immediate suspect. Months later, Johnny's mother received photographs that allegedly showed her son in captivity. Those images sparked new inquiries and a spate of theories, some plausible, others sensational, about trafficking and conspiracies. Johnny's mother became a relentless advocate who challenged investigators and kept public attention fixed on the case. Over the years, claims surfaced that Johnny had been sighted alive. Other investigators treated those claims as unreliable. Officially, the case remains unsolved. Johnny's disappearance left a broader imprint on public policy and parental behavior. For a generation, his photos symbolized the unseen risks to children on familiar routes. The emotional toll on his family and the persistent allegations that follow make the case not just a missing person file, but a cautionary tale about how uncertainty can metastasize into competing narratives. What lingers is the photograph, reproduced, examined, and debated, and the question of whether a lost boy became the center of something larger than the community that raised him. The Gosch case remains a lesson in how unresolved disappearances invite both compassion and obsession. Case 09, Lacey Peterson, 2002, Modesto, San Francisco Bay, California. Lacey Peterson was 8 months pregnant when she disappeared on Christmas Eve 2002. Her husband reported her missing days later, and the search that followed became a major media story. Investigators pursued the evidence on land, interviewed family and friends, and eventually searched coastal areas where the tide and currents introduced their own complications. Tragically, human remains matching Lacey and her unborn child were recovered months later in San Francisco Bay. The manner and location of the recovery raised questions about staging and travel paths. The body had been placed where ocean currents could move it, issues that forensic teams and prosecutors would examine closely. Lacey's husband was charged, tried, and convicted of murder. The case was litigated intensely in courtrooms and across news cycles. Lacey's disappearance and the subsequent trial highlighted the ways domestic tragedies can unfold into prolonged public spectacle. For her family, the legal conviction offered a measure of accountability, but could not erase the particular grief of losing both a mother and her unborn child. The case also forced conversations about how evidence in water recovery cases is collected and interpreted, and how media attention can shape public understanding of a trial. What remains haunting is the ordinary scene transformed into permanent absence, a holiday dinner that did not happen, a family portrait missing a face. The legal outcome answered the question of responsibility, but the deeper human losses are irrecoverable. Case 10, Maura Murray, 2004, Haverhill, Woodsville area, New Hampshire. Final, unresolved. Maura Murray's disappearance is one of those mysteries that lodges in people's minds because it resists easy explanation at every turn. She was 21 and a college student who, on a February afternoon in 2004, informed friends by phone that she had an emergency and was leaving. Later that day, she crashed her car on a rural road. A passing motorist reported seeing her walk away from the scene, carrying items in her hands. When officers arrived, she was gone. What followed was a long, contentious investigation. Some witnesses reported seeing a woman matching her description in nearby towns. Others recalled different details. Items found in the car suggested she had planned at least a short trip, maps, cash, and possessions, but not a definitive destination. Over time, internet communities formed around the case, combing satellite images, interviewing locals, and sharing theories.
Law enforcement maintained that no solid forensic link or witness account proved whether Maura had been picked up by someone, succumbed to the elements, or left voluntarily to begin a new life. The lack of resolution has kept the case alive in a particular way. Unlike many disappearances that fade into uncertain files, Maura's story became a magnet for both careful amateur researchers and less reliable speculation. For her family and for many who follow missing person work, the case exemplifies the double-edged nature of public attention. It keeps interest and occasional tips coming, but it also multiplies unverified claims that can distract from formal investigative avenues. What haunts Maura's disappearance is the ordinary decision that becomes irreversible, the choice to drive away from a life that was, from the outside, full of promise. The final image is not conclusive. The car on a roadside, the empty boots, the unanswered phone messages. The case remains open, one of the later entries on a list of disappearances that continue to refuse tidy endings.
Conclusion. Across these 10 cases, you can trace patterns and contrasts. Children who vanish from routes everyone assumed were safe. Adults who disappear in moments that read like impulsive decisions. Cases later resolved through confession or forensic advances, and a number that remains stubbornly open. Each story shows a different face of absence. A child who never returns from a morning walk, a woman taken from a locked house, a disappearance at sea, a scene on a deserted road, and each leaves behind a family forced to live across a gap of not knowing. There's a technical lesson here too. Forensic science and databases have changed what's possible. DNA reanalysis has turned cold cases into prosecutions, and international cooperation can extend investigative reach. But science alone is not a cure for uncertainty. Preservation practices, interagency communication, and the patience of investigators and families all matter. Some cases are solved decades later. Others remain artifacts of historical limitations. If this episode moved you, the description contains links to primary reporting, law enforcement press releases, and public records used to construct these accounts. If you have verified, well-sourced information that could legitimately assist an open investigation, use the secure submission form linked below. Do not post tips in comments or attempt private inquiries. Responsible reporting and careful outreach are the only ways to turn public attention into usable evidence. If you found value in this deep dive and want to help sustain more careful, victim-centered reporting like this, consider supporting the channel through Patreon or a YouTube membership. You'll find the links in the description. Above all, say the names aloud when you can. Remembering is a small act of solidarity with people who continue to wait. Which of these disappearances will keep turning in your mind tonight?